Welcome to the November 6, 2024 meeting of the Redmond Planning Commission. I'd like to call this meeting to order. We'll start with a roll call. Commissioner Aparna.
Present.
Commissioner Copley.
Present.
Commissioner Van Nyman.
Present.
Vice Chair Woodyer.
Present.
And I am Chair Weston. Commissioners Gagne and Coleman are excused tonight. Thank you to the following staff for being present: Jeff Churchill, Glenn Coyle, Kim Dietz, and Chris Wyatt. I look for a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Seconded.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thanks, that's approved. And I look for a motion to approve the meeting minutes from October 23rd, 2024.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. That's also approved. All right, now it is time for us to hear public comment and items from the audience, specifically topics that aren't addressed by our public hearing later tonight. We'll keep your comments to 3 minutes and start with your name and address.
Okay, we have two folks. First is David Morton, please.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm David Morton, Redmond 98053. Redmond has a critical aquifer recharge area, or CARA 1, which is an area that is particularly vulnerable to groundwater contamination. Within CARA 1, it's important to prohibit certain land uses or activities to protect the local drinking water supply. Here are some activities that are prohibited. First, liquid petroleum refining, reprocessing, and storage. Petroleum products, including gasoline, diesel, and lubricants, contain a wide range of hazardous chemicals that can easily contaminate groundwater if spilled or leaked. Refining, reprocessing, and storing these substances poses a high risk of accidental releases, which could have devastating impacts on the local aquifer. Groundwater contamination by petroleum products is difficult and expensive to remediate, making prevention the best approach. Second, chemical manufacturing. Chemical manufacturing facilities handle a variety of synthetic organic and inorganic compounds, many of which are toxic and persistent in the environment. Accidental spills, leaks, or improper waste disposal from these facilities can lead to the introduction of these harmful chemicals into the groundwater system. Many chemical contaminants are resistant to natural degradation processes, meaning they can remain in the aquifer for extended periods, posing a long-term threat to water quality. Third, vehicle fueling facilities must implement performance standards. Gas stations and other fuel retail establishments have a high risk of leaks and spills from underground storage tanks, fuel dispensing equipment, and vehicle refueling activities. Even small-scale spills at these sites can quickly migrate into the groundwater, contaminating the drinking water supply. The frequent turnover of customers and vehicles at these locations increases the chances of an accidental release of fuel. And fourth, golf courses. Golf courses often require the extensive use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides to maintain the desired playing conditions. These chemicals can readily leach into the groundwater, especially in areas with highly permeable soils or shallow water tables. Contamination of the aquifer by these agricultural chemicals can lead to serious health and environmental consequences, as they can persist in the environment and bioaccumulate in the food chain. By prohibiting these high-risk activities and land uses within CARA 1, Redmond can effectively protect its critical groundwater resources and ensure a safe, reliable drinking water supply for the community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next up is Devin Kellogg.
Good evening, Redmond Planning Commissioners and staff. My name is Devin Kellogg. I'm a parent, teacher, and stable climate advocate living at Education Hill, and I'm here to speak tonight on audit item 6 of the agenda, specifically the Green Buildings Program. First of all, I would like to say I'm in full support of moving green buildings elements into the requirements category. While it's not clear yet what the results or impact of Initiative 2066 concerning building decarbonization planning will be at, I'd like to point out a few things. First is retaining our decarbonization goals and pathways is showing to be popular in King County by a margin of 60%, despite fears stemming from broad misconceptions about what this looks like. Even if 2066 passes and certain local pathways are blocked, there are potential challenges to this initiative coming, and at worst, our legislature will be able to modify the restrictions in 2 years. Either way, buildings still need to comply with our state's green building performance standards, and we will still need to hit greenhouse gas reduction targets set out both in statute and in our local sustainability goals. Since buildings are the largest source of greenhouse gases in cities, the changes proposed to the Green Buildings Program would help us achieve these critical goals. And it looks like we will retain state funding through the CCA to support us. Federal is less certain. Next, as you review these materials, please consider the kinds of solutions being proposed to address the concerns folks have about transitioning off of gas for both buildings and cars. Regarding EV-ready section, I concur with Dr. Morton's 40th talk to the Redmond Planning Commission comments from October 23rd. I would like to particularly call out his suggestions about 100% EV-capable requirements, retrofit supports, right-to-charge policies, and load-sharing options. I would further highlight the promising two-way battery charging technologies that are being seriously proposed as potential large-scale solutions for both grid stability and local resilience as we electrify. A Ford F-150, for example, has storage capacity of 5 to 10 Tesla Powerwalls at a fraction of the cost and can power a building for days. Some solutions being proposed to decarbonize larger buildings and even whole neighborhoods include ground source heat pumps and/or district-wide heating cooling systems. These systems are not only cleaner, safer, more energy efficient, they are also less costly to use and maintain. The cooling these systems provide also help mitigate the deadly heat waves identified in our resilience plan as a top risk for our most vulnerable Redmond residents. And lastly, as you consider the costs of green building program elements, please also factor in the rapidly increasing costs of building materials, labor, insurance, and energy costs, which are either directly or indirectly related to climate impacts, which, as we know, will continue to go up the longer we delay action. Please help ensure a strong and future-focused green buildings program in the 2050 code package. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is it for our items from the audience.
All right, in that case, we are going to start the public hearing on zones and uses in the 2025 code package for Redmond 2050. Bringing up Jeff Churchill.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. I'm here for Becky Fry, who could not be here this evening. And tonight is the public hearing for the first part of the 2025 code package, which is zones and uses. And as you may recall, this is focused on Article 1 of the Redmond Zoning Code. Now, what does Article 1 mean? Article 1 is where all the chapters are that are oriented around zones, and it's also where the chapter contains all of the allowed uses in each zone. So this is, it's every zone, so I won't list them all. So that's the content. We've been reviewing it together for about a month now, and there is no slide presentation, but that's the brief recap, and that ends my presentation.
Great, thank you. In that case, I'm going to open the public hearing. And Glenn is going to introduce our commenters.
Okay, we have 2 folks signed up for the audience and 1 person's going to call in. So the first from the audience is David Morton.
And once again, if you could start with your name and address.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm David Morton, Redmond, 98053. In draft 1.3 of Chapter 2104, I ask that the following text be kept. Quote, in the case of a conflict between RZC 2164-050 critical aquifer recharge areas and the use table 2104-0200, the CARA regulations shall prevail, end quote. I agree with the comment in the right margin, which says that, quote, reference to CARA is added to ensure it is clear that 2164 will apply, end quote. The conflict statement seems necessary if the L2 designation does not appear everywhere it should in Table 2104-0200. So, in Table 2104-0200, I ask that an L2 designation be inserted into the 14 cells that are indicated with a large red L2 as shown in the email. The land uses of concern in the table are retail sales of gasoline and diesel, golf courses, and manufacturing of chemicals and hot mix asphalt. Gasoline and diesel are refined liquid petroleum. Gasoline stations sell and store gasoline and diesel in underground tanks that often hold 20,000 to 60,000 gallons in total. The sale of gasoline and diesel is not specifically prohibited by CARA regulations, but the storage of liquid petroleum is prohibited. Since gasoline stations don't have their own use designation in Table 2104-0200, presumably they are grouped with retail sales. Golf courses and chemical manufacturing are also prohibited in CARA 1. 40% of Redmond's municipal water supply comes from a shallow, unconfined aquifer upon which the city is built. Redmond must take care not to contaminate the aquifer with unhealthy, toxic, and carcinogenic chemicals. The Growth Management Act requires cities to adopt development regulations that protect such aquifers. Redmond mustn't wait until its residents come down with unexplained illnesses before enforcing regulations intended to prevent contamination of its drinking water. Redmond's CARA regulations are intended to manage and prohibit land uses and activities that can potentially contaminate Redmond's drinking water aquifer. In conclusion, the CARA regulations in RZC 2164-050 must prevail over the use table in 2104-0200 to ensure Redmond's critical drinking water aquifer is properly protected from potential contamination by prohibited land uses. Thank you.
Next up is Devin Kellogg.
Hi there. Good evening. Devin Kellogg, an Education Hill resident. I just had a quick second to everything that Dr. Morton's been saying about the aquifer, and just another shout out to why it's really important that we help transition to cleaner forms of transportation with EVs and other options you're considering. And yes, I do have examples of how burdensome these underground gas tanks especially can be, so I will forward some data for you about that. Thank you.
All right, and we just have one person calling in, Rachel Mazur, and I will call them in.
This is Rachel.
Hi there, you're with the Redmond Planning Commission for the public hearing on the zoning code?
Yes.
Great. If you could ever start with your name and address?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Mazur, 999 3rd Avenue in Seattle. And should I start with the public comment?
That'd be wonderful. Thanks.
Great. Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to comment this evening. Like I said, I'm Rachel Mazur. I'm a land use attorney at Hillis, Clark, Martin, and Peterson. I represent Columbia Pacific Advisors, who owns the property located at 6900 188th Avenue Northeast. As you may know, this property is split zoned, and importantly, it's a designated business park on the eastern portion of the site along 191st Avenue Northeast. This property is adjacent to a parcel owned by the Lake Washington School District, an in-process multifamily residential development, as well as a park. Given this neighborhood proximity, really makes the property prime for a future residential development. However, due to the changes contemplated in the Redmond zoning code, it will prohibit residential uses in the BP zones going forward. We urge you to consider the negative outcomes of this legislative change. We therefore request that you make a modest adjustment to this anticipated change to allow residential uses on or adjacent to properties owned by the Lake Washington School District. We feel that this approach is more consistent with the Redmond 2050 Comprehensive Plan. Thanks so much for considering these comments.
Thank you. All right, with that, I'm going to leave open the verbal and written portions of the public hearing, and we are going to switch to our study session, so back to staff.
Okay, I guess I have one question and then a proposal. The question is, would you like us to add the issues raised in public testimony to the issues matrix?
Yeah, I think there's broad consensus here about adding especially the the Cara gas station question, but specifically actually just the editing marks on table 21040200.
Okay, yep, I got that.
Okay, and then are there specific other questions that people would like to ask or add to the matrix?
I'd like to add the third comment from Rachel. I want to have a closer look at that.
Okay, do you want to formulate a question on that?
Not right now, but I will do so. Do I have to do that now, or do I do that via email?
It's up to you.
Yeah, I'd like to just kind of add it to the issues management matrix because I want to look into the details that she's referring to, so I have an informed opinion.
All right, so maybe we could add a placeholder, and Vice Chair Woodyear will follow up with the questions you'd like to ask.
Sure, that would be fine.
Great, and sorry, Commissioner Copley.
Based on David's comment, I'd like to make sure that gas stations are called out as their own use and they're not lumped into retail.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Parna. Commissioner Parna?
Sorry, I was on mute. Is this a time to ask for new comments to be added to the matrix from our side?
Actually, why don't we do new ones at the end? I think we were just addressing public comment.
Okay,
We'll go through
got it.
and then we'll do sweeps.
Thank
for
you.
New feedback. Thank you.
Okay, so my proposal is that we walk through the issues matrix that we have to discuss issues that are still open. A number of those issues were opened by Commissioner Coleman, who is not present tonight, and so I would propose that we are coming back to this in 2 weeks for sure. So I just propose that we defer those if that works for the commissioner.
That's great. And we also had a good review of those last week with everyone else present. So we're just going to wait until he's here and can give his feedback.
So we'll skip over those for tonight, but then we'll handle the rest that are in here.
Great.
And so there's going to be a fair amount of scrolling, so close your eyes. Okay. Okay, the first one that is open and not from Commissioner Coleman is issue 13 about bicycle and scooter parking. And so the response has been updated to note that there will be an e-mobility strategy in the Transportation Master Plan and that this would be part of that.
I'm comfortable closing this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, the next one is issue 16 about the corridor mixed use zone. And it's really a process, it's part process question, how would that happen to have new property zone corridor mixed use? And it's part substance question of what would be the considerations. And so we put quite a bit of detail in the response as Commissioner Parna's issue, and I'll turn it back to the commission.
So I like the detail of the response, but now I have a further question, and pardon me if it sounds kind of silly, but why would corridor mixed use type be a specific type? If we are this close to a citywide mixed use, why do we want a separate land use called corridor mixed use. And we have just one, and then a parcel doesn't have to go through the whole, should somebody want to do a mixed use building along one of those big streets, we don't have to go through a whole docket process. I'm just trying to understand what was the reasoning behind that. Why couldn't we fold in the old neighborhood commercial 1 and 2 zones into the new mixed use zone? So that's the, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So I want to make sure I understood the first part of your question. So citywide mixed use is a land use designation that's in the comprehensive plan. And there are 2 zones that are in that family. There's corridor mixed use and there's urban mixed use. And then to the second part of what you were saying, why weren't neighborhood commercial 1 and 2 folded into mixed use? They were. The neighborhood commercials, the properties that were zoned neighborhood commercial, the properties that are zoned neighborhood commercial today would be zoned corridor mixed use going forward. Those zones were essentially collapsed into corridor mixed use together with general commercial, all lumped into one. So there's just fewer zones, but those properties got carried forward as mixed use properties.
Yeah, so, but why do we have a separate corridor mixed use property is my question. Because if we have, why do we need so many subcategories? If we just have one, for the sake of simplicity, from what I'm understanding, there's a citywide mixed use land use. So why does corridor need to be a separate call out when it's citywide?
I guess they're apples and oranges. The citywide mixed use is a family of zones. It's a land use designation in the comprehensive plan. Corridor mixed use is one of them. The other one is urban mixed use. And I believe that, well, I know that there are far fewer zones going forward as proposed than today, right? So I think we have done a lot of collapsing to reduce the amount of slicing and dicing on the zoning map. The reason that corridor mixed use exists, and the 2 other zones really that we're talking about that are on either side of corridor mixed use, one of them is urban mixed use, and the other one's neighborhood mixed use, which is in a separate land use category, is that neighborhood mixed use, as proposed, is pretty small scale and really wouldn't allow that kinds of opportunities I think that we would need in those corridor mixed use zones. And urban mixed use, it's mostly scale. Urban mixed use is pretty dense, pretty high intensity, akin to this, more like the centers, more like downtown. And so corridor mixed use is that thing kind of in the middle, in sort of the zoning scheme.
Okay, thank you. You can close this. I was just curious. The scale part really explains it. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Great questions. Okay. Let's see. Commissioner Coleman was on 17. 18 is about neighborhood mixed use. Could other parcels be rezoned in the future? From Commissioner Woodyer. The short answer is yes.
I'm satisfied with the response. You can go ahead and close it.
Neighborhood mixed use again, and neighborhood mixed use and homeowners associations. What roles do HOAs play? In short, HOAs have CC&Rs, covenants, codes, restrictions. Probably gonna get it wrong. that may disqualify parcels from being neighborhood mixed use.
Yeah, and I see the note that the interested property owners can then go back and try to negotiate those changes.
Right.
So I'm comfortable closing this. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let's see. Okay, on to uses. And believe there's a bunch of issues now about uses, especially with respect to neighborhood mixed use. I'm starting with allowed uses in the neighborhood mixed use zones. There are specific questions about golf course, other parks and rec, rapid charging stations, animal boarding, and kennels.
So these were all just clarifications. I thought this was all reasonable. The dog the last one about the animal boarding, kennels, and doggy daycares, I don't know if it makes sense to expand the definition to actually explicitly include doggy daycares to save a call to the city, or if it's easy to just leave it as is, and then people will call if they're confused.
Is the suggestion just to have a separate use so that it can be identified as not allowed?
No, it was more just that, like, animal boarding and kennels isn't necessarily quite the same as doggy daycares, which are usually during the day only. So if what we're saying here is, oh, doggy daycares definitely fall under this category, then just adding them into the description might make sense, because I don't think that's necessarily obvious.
Got it, okay. Let me make a note of that. Should we keep that one open so we can come back with text, potentially?
I suppose it's such a small change that I'm actually willing to close it, but because it's really just adding like that word into the list.
Okay. Okay, neighborhood mixed use and drive-throughs.
Yeah, this change is great. This can close.
All right, now home businesses and materially detrimental as a term.
Yep, and I really like this amendment also. I just like letting people know what criteria are even going into a phrase like that. So this change seemed great. We can close. Although I wasn't sure what it said. It said see related information in item 22 below. You might want to remove that line in the description from the issues matrix, because that seems like that didn't make sense to me.
22 is also above. So.
Right. Yeah, I puzzled on that one for a while. There we go.
It made sense last Friday.
Seemed like a remnant.
Okay, home businesses and signage.
Yes. I'm okay with this. I don't think it's urgent. I just think that it's one of those things that's already coming up. There's a lot of like, it just seems like a lot of people are taking down signs or throwing them away from the side. There's been a lot of like sign buildup in our neighborhood. So I'm glad if they're coming back to revisit it later, but we can close for now.
Okay, home businesses and quality of life.
I'm happy with the detailed response. You can go ahead and close that.
Okay, accessory commercial uses and what resource, oh wait, that was already closed. Pardon me. Keep going. Okay, food truck courts, number 34.
Yeah, this one was great, and can definitely close.
Okay, and then the downtown TOD focus area in lot 11 at Town Center.
Yeah, an updated map would be great.
I believe the updated map has already been made. I'm not sure that it exists in the version that's published online, but that it will.
Yeah, thanks for addressing this, so that can close.
Okay. That's the end of the current issues.
Great. So can we add in new comments if commissioners have any? I think starting with Commissioner Aparna.
Thank you, Chair. So I had a question about neighborhood mixed use or home-based businesses, all the conditional uses. How do we go about approving uses that could be resource intensive? So if it's a small lot, like I know golf courses came up in the neighborhood mixed use. I know it's small size, but heavy watering or small crypto mining suites or data centers, small scale like that. I'm just giving very broad examples, but the idea that there are some uses in those some users could be using a lot of resources in terms of energy or water. How do we make sure that those are either reviewed or not accepted at all?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm able to just answer it right now. And that is that in the code, and there's a section on home businesses. It's 2104-1150, and there's a set of requirements. And one of the requirements is that utility demand shall not exceed normal residential levels.
So that would then beg the question that if we had a little cafe which generated waste, right, then that wouldn't work out.
I think that depends on the level of activity of the cafe. We can add this to the issues makers and have a written response. But like utility availability is something that gets reviewed when there are permit applications.
Okay. Just so that we have that somewhere, and also just because if the energy use is not much, but let's say they have a few extra carts or need a bigger can for garbage or recycling, would that preclude it or not? It's an open question, right? So thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Copley.
I'm curious if the comments that were made 2 weeks ago and then again today from the land use attorney on the BP zoned property next to the property owned by Lake Washington School District, if it is consistent with the Redmond 2050 vision to have residential uses next to properties owned by the school district.
So what I would say is that it is, I think what the crux of the issue is that the part of the property that's zoned BP, the land use policies for that zone don't allow housing. And the school district, I mean, the zoning and the purchase, like they were happening all within the last few years. There is quite a bit of land that is zoned residential around that property. I think if the city were going, if the landowner wanted to have housing on the property, what the city could consider then is an application for a change in the comprehensive plan designation or in the zoning to something that allowed housing. I think it would be problematic from a comp plan standpoint to say housing is allowed on this BP property, even though the policy says that it shouldn't be.
Okay, I don't know that this needs to be added to the issues matrix, but I did want to check because this is part of the land uses section. So, and this has been brought up for 2 meetings, so I wanted to make sure this was addressed or at least considered by.
Okay, well, I think Commissioner Woodyear wanted that. I'll add it because Commissioner Woodyear had requested it earlier.
Why don't we use mics instead of?
I'd like it added as a placeholder.
Sure. And that'll give us an opportunity to write stuff down too.
I do want to say that my personal take on that is that it doesn't necessarily make sense to make blanket rules next to schools just because there are a lot of schools. And so I think that we should kind of handle this with a little more subtlety than that. But I appreciate them bringing it to us, of course, and public comment's always important. Oh, Commissioner Aparna.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to that. If it is currently zoned as BP, I mean, they always have the option of going through the docket process, right, Jeff? In terms of changing the zone if need be. Because otherwise we're revisiting everything which is owned by the school district and what's neighboring to that, right?
Yes, the docket process is available. As the way I understood, the person who commented was that it would require, it would result in rules that apply adjacent to all property owned by the district.
Right, and do we really want to go poking that bear is my question to the commission. So.
Fair point. All right, are there additional questions to add to this portion of the matrix by other commissioners? No, I think we're good, so we'll move on.
Moving on to the next agenda item then?
Oh, yes,
right?
I'll introduce it. How about that? A study session on incentives and requirements in the 2025 code package for Redmond 2050.
Okay, wonderful. So for the first time, after a couple of meetings introducing the content by PowerPoint in October, we have a few chapters to look at with real text. And in addition, you've developed an issues matrix over the last couple of meetings. And so there are issues with responses in there, and we can start to work through those. So what I would propose is that we open the text. We don't need to read every page, but I just want to highlight some of the big things, and then go to the issues matrix. That would be okay?
Yep, that sounds great.
So there are 3 chapters published and shared with you, and got a lot more than that open, so just got to find the right things. Here we go. Okay, they were chapter 2116, Site Requirements Measurement and Other Applicable Regulations. What is really happening here? So first of all, what this chapter includes is how do you measure stuff that's in the zoning code? When it talks about setbacks, what does that mean? When it talks about floor area, how do you measure it? When it talks about gross floor area, what does that mean? This chapter already exists and is already chapter 21.16. There's also a section in the existing residential chapter that covers a lot of the same information, but just for residential zones. So it's how do you measure setbacks and how do you measure setbacks? And ideally, those would be the same, and we could write it down one time. So that's the goal, is to merge that content into a single chapter that would apply to all zones, and that's what's happened here. So where there's been duplication, the proposal is to get rid of the content that's in the existing residential chapter. Where it's duplicated here, really there's no change needed. Where there were slightly different kind of descriptions of how to measure something, we pick one to go with. So that's what's going on here. And I'm just going to scroll. That's like a good example. This is actually an example of something else. This is in the section about height, and there's a number of exceptions that exist, such as for hose towers for fire stations, for example, or chimneys or antenna. One exception that the council was interested in was making sure that encroachments related to green building construction methods were allowed, so that so that we were not impeding the ability to use those methods of construction to advance sustainability ends. So that was a request by council, and that's how it's been kind of manifested here in this chapter. There's another paragraph like that that just has to do with setbacks instead of height, which is right here. So same concept, encroachments into the setback area that are related to those green building construction methods. This section is minimum density required. This was a this is a carryover from the residential chapter. The only change here has to do with new zones. So the neighborhood mixed use zoning district, consistent with the actual zone chapter regulation, there's a minimum residential density of 1 dwelling per lot, unless it has a food truck court, in which case it could just be the food truck court. Okay, there are some changes here just related to names of zones. And that's it. So very little happening in 2116. But the idea is that we can collapse 2 chapters into 1. 2136, also, the reason you got these 3 is that they're easiest to publish. There's not a lot happening in any of these 3. But 2136 is open space. You reviewed some major changes to open space earlier this year that are pending before council in a couple of weeks. This is much less. What we're talking about here is there's the types of open space, and they form a hierarchy, and they're described. So all of that exists. What's new is a description really that talks about the different kinds of open space, their purpose, who manages them, the kind of permit process that one uses to get permission for such open space. It's not really it's really more descriptive than regulatory. It is in the types of open space section. And these are what you've heard before. So there's the required open space. So if the code requires 20% open space in every lot, this is the open space that you're providing. There's the publicly accessible enhanced amenity spaces. These are the incentivized spaces that exist in incentive programs for the zone that an applicant can choose to put on their site to enhance it. There are the privately owned public spaces. Those are very much like public parks, but they are operated privately and accessible publicly. And a good example of that is Astera Park in Overlake, which is a POPS. And then there are parks, which are owned publicly, operated publicly, in every sense that you would think of it. And so it describes kind of what they're for, how they're owned, who reviews them, and any kind of other applicable zoning regulations in other chapters. So design standards is chapter 58. The incentives chapter is chapter 55. So this all is just really meant to give clarity about the different kinds of open space. Okay, then third is the green building program. You also reviewed this in its, almost in its entirety, I think much earlier in the year. The conversation that we kept talking about was, well, how would this apply outside of Overlake? So that's what this is about. And where that shows up is in this table. This is a matrix that says, well, what green building elements are mandatory and where are they mandatory? And this table is new. Centers are the left column of the different types of zones, where everything that was proposed to be mandatory in Overlake is also proposed to be mandatory in all of the other centers. And then you have outside of the centers, and you have different types of development. You have commercial development or non-residential, mixed-use development, and multifamily. And and the other centers is really the conversation and discussion that we want to have with the Planning Commission about, well, what's appropriate for mandatory versus optional with these different kinds of development in different kinds of zones. I want to highlight EV parking, which is number 4, because that has no number in it. It just says provide X% of parking as EV ready. That's because we're ready to publish the chapter, but not the specifics on EV charging infrastructure, which we do expect to have for you in your next packet. That's really the big change. It's what should be mandatory for green building outside of Overlake. That's the conversation. And those are the 3 chapters that were in your packet. And shall I maybe, do you want to add any issues that you got from reading that discussion right now, or you want to hold that to the end?
Let's add now, and then we'll do a pass, and then if people have additional at the end, then we'll do that. Commissioner Copley.
First, thanks for taking all the comments about EV parking and putting in a whole section about that. That's great. Before you guys do come up with a percentage of parking that needs to be EV ready, have there been any studies or is there any data about what percentage of vehicles in Redmond today are EVs and how many will be forecasted to be?
Yes, there is. I don't have the numbers offhand, but when we talked about this with council, the DOL provides data on new registrations that are EVs, and something like a quarter of new registrations in Redmond. They don't provide any forecasts, but we can supply the same information that we supplied to council.
I have one question to add. I'm still noodling about the privately owned public spaces. And so specifically in table 2136030B, which I really like on the whole. I like having a table trying to like quantify this new hierarchy and these new roles. I would love if you could add a row to that table that goes across and describes where the programming is coming from, whether it's city or private. Because to me, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is this is a real public benefit if we can keep track of them. So I was trying to think like, where are the places where we can go to actually add more integration between the city's recreation department or city hall services or that sort of thing, and then these places where additional private programming will be added. And I think that integration is really tricky to do well, but it's really helpful to residents. And so I don't know if adding an appendix to the park plan, this is a second suggestion, or somewhere else of these pop spaces and the owners would be helpful, or if there's another way that the city can keep track of it easily as time goes on and more of these get added, but they just seem so valuable, and especially as our population goes up. I just want to make sure we're really, like there's some centralized tracking so that it's easy for people to find and it's easy for people in the city to keep track of.
Okay.
Sorry, who am I looking at? Commissioner Aparna.
I actually have 3 points or 3 questions. So in the purpose of the green building program, I do not see a mention of conservation of trees or encourage a conservation of natural environment. I understand that these are dealt elsewhere, but by not acknowledging this in the green building program, like before we used to have the low impact developments, which basically talked about improving a site with a light touch. I don't know if that is needed here, but I think it would be nice to at least acknowledge that it's a holistic program and not just about the built form, because the built form's sitting somewhere. So that was my first point. The second one I had a question is the use of penalties. There is so I was wondering if you could add that to the issue matrix, the one on the natural environment piece. But the second one also, and I don't know if this is beyond our purview, so please forgive me if it isn't, but when we are setting up penalties for non-compliance. So why not explicitly try to have a fund to help low-income owners become more energy efficient? So these penalties go like from the green building program, penalties go into more green building of existing building stock. Does that make sense?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Instead of going into a general fund, which there's no specific mention, it would be nice to have something like that which funds other programs in the green building space, right? And the third one is, I know we have mandatory reporting of all the energy uses, but and I know we are likely to be using Energy Star or other databases, but how is a city putting together or compiling all that data to study citywide consumption of new buildings and so on? So how are we going to have our own database, or are we just pulling it from the Energy Star database to get to track data for within our city, not specific buildings? I don't know if that
Can you
question
clarify
made
that
sense.
question? Actually, no, it doesn't entirely. Are you talking about tracking long-term usage? Because that seems like that would be done by the utility. Or are you
No,
talking
no.
about?
So the mandatory reporting is basically what is part of the green building program. The mandatory reporting of the EUI, which is the energy usage intensity. It's by square footage, it's not by kilowatt hour. Okay. So by the end of it, we are collecting this data from several buildings. Okay, all these new developments, we're asking for the data. We're asking them year on year to give us this data. Now, this data is likely to be sitting in Energy Star, which is the federal database. But is the city going to compile all these project data for us to understand how we are doing overall, or is it just going to be individual metrics? The reason I'm saying this is when you want to make a baseline study for the next round of changes, you need to have compiled data.
Got it.
Thank
you.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
So is the city, like, does Energy Star have a city option? I know from an individual building perspective what Energy Star provides, but does this city get a different look-see into the entire portfolio of buildings? If that is so, then we have an option. But otherwise, just getting the data and not doing anything with it will not help us.
Okay.
Great. Sounds like that's getting added.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I
Any
will.
other new ones on what was just presented? No. Okay, so back to Jeff.
Okay, so I am pulling up the issues matrix for this content with the issues that have been identified so far, and I will skip ones that have Commissioner Coleman's name attached to them, which brings us to number 3, which is how are the incentive points assigned?
Yeah, so this is that big table. And so what I was trying to get at is I think in order to provide meaningful feedback here, I think we just need a little bit better sense of what the goals are and how people can kind of appreciate if what we're doing in different zones is moving us closer to target. Like, which are the really high value targets where we're like, oh, we really want this in this particular zone, beyond just the very low to very high ranking. Because there were some where I guess I'm looking for a little bit more of the why behind. And if we feel like if we manage to get all of these very highs marked in the right places, does that kind of meet our bar and our goal for the incentives? Or like kind of how far down this table do we have to get before we feel like we've really like met the mark?
Right.
And this answer, I feel like we're still being asked for information, but I don't know that we necessarily quite have the context yet to be able to provide valuable feedback.
Sure. So one thing we could do is open the table up and look through it together tonight, or we could do that at a future meeting. At the discretion of the commission, I have to find the table in the earlier materials. I don't have it pulled up at the moment. Oh, this must be it.
It's in 21.
you speaking of the table that was distributed separately in October, that just has the very high, very low, and with, well, I guess.
This was
instead of
also,
describing
it was
to you,
linked in the memo this week, which helps.
does it look like this?
Yes, that one.
This is the one. Okay. So I guess some context I will add, and you can tell me if this is kind of hitting the mark, is that where this really arises from is a melding of kind of what we heard in the community about what people's priorities are and what we know to be, A, possible and B, missing in a particular zone. So there are, for example, Overlake relative to downtown has fewer public open spaces and public parks. And so it's a higher priority in Overlake than in downtown, like that kind of set of incentives. We also have been planning Marymore as a pilot inclusive neighborhood. And so, those will rate very high in Marymore, which is not to say that they're not important elsewhere, but that's why they would get a very high in that zone. Also, sometimes it had to do with size. The corridor mixed-use parcels, for example, tend not to be very large. And also neighborhood mixed use will be even smaller. And so many of the larger items either don't show up on the list at all or show up as lower priorities because they are less likely to be feasible. And so it's those kinds of factors that generated the proposal in the table about how to weight the incentives in different zones.
Okay, so that actually really helps a lot because so you're saying that the ranking has to do with the gap between what the city wants in a zone and what.
That's definitely part of it, yes.
Okay, so then what sort of feedback on this particular table would be most useful from planning commissioners? Is it going into specific cells and saying like, I don't understand why this was like, just low versus medium low, or
Right.
that 7-point scale is a little hard to follow in terms of providing feedback because the granularity is a little tough.
Sure, there's a lot of granularity. There's also a lot of incentives in the table. I think would be a lot to ask of you to go into every cell and kind of it was even a lot to ask of us to kind of go in and make a determination of what to put in there. I think what would be kind of a more reasonable ask is to maybe look at, whole categories. And as you're looking through this, kind of saying, well, is there anything here that feels like it's really off? Like you might look at the very lows and the very highs and say, like, is this something that really like is not going to work? Or I think this is really missing. I hear about this in community, in my own life experience. This is something we really need in this area, but you've said, that it's only medium, like what's going on here? So I think that kind of category level and also kind of bringing your own life experience to these ratings would be really helpful.
That makes a lot of sense. Can I add one specific request on this table? Would it be possible to get a version of it that has grayscale, just one of those like auto formulas where you add colors in based on the cell contents? So if very low is white and very high is black, and we just had a scale in that, I think it would be way easier to visually scan it. Because everything starts with V in my brain. Like, it's just very hard to get through this and be like, oh, I see what's happening here. I would really appreciate that. That would make it easier. Commissioner Aparna.
Yeah, I actually had a thought about this too. So I don't know if this was already discussed before, but Chair, as you pointed out, and as Jeff pointed out, each zone is requiring a certain priority, right? But what is that outcome that we desire? So in my head, I try to simplify it think of a very weird version of the Maslow's pyramid, right? So in some zones, we are optimizing for basics of shelter, like we're looking for housing and more housing, and we're looking to build more affordable housing. And in other places, we are starting with more parks, say, or art or something which is higher in the pyramid. So that pyramid keeps shifting colors and shapes, but having what the city is looking for in along each column, along each zone, will really help us prioritize. Now, if we think, and if the logic behind this is clearly written on top, we can then decide if we agree with the logic or not, and then recalibrate accordingly, right? So what I would request is a row above, above the header row, which talks about the outcome desired for each. Forget the details, more like we are looking for more housing, or we are looking for people to live here, people to play here, whatever the city wants to put in. I'm
Some
finding it
framing.
very hard to see why this came up in this way, because I can point out to some anomalies which I'm not understanding. Like outside the TOD, we don't have enough. It's very low priority to have family-friendly, affordable housing. For me, I'm of the opinion that we would be, if inside TOD it's all about having the 1 bedroom and the 2 bedroom, the 3 bedroom affordable housing is going nowhere in our priority list. We can't mandate that in the residential zones, right? But so for me, all those things start playing in, and I'm finding a lot of anomalies in terms of my understanding of the desire for this zone the way it is.
So that's helpful, and I think what we'll do here is continue to talk about this. We have several more weeks. I was just,
Right.
in this particular question, I was looking for additional steering of basically how to evaluate this table and what we're looking for. So
Right,
if-
exactly. So if we had another row attached on the top, we definitely would be able to evaluate it better, right? This is the logic behind how we've done this. This is why this is showing up so strongly here. There's a gap, whatever, right? But a single row of explanation on the top gives us context to how to evaluate this.
Great. Okay, thank you. Commissioner Commissioner Copley.
I'm not sure that we need 7 keys on the prioritization, just because only 5 are being used. So it looks like it starts at medium low, but that's the lowest. There is no low or very low. So that could be helpful in simplifying it.
Give us a table and I really like this concept. It's just getting it a little bit more so we know what we're doing is great.
I appreciate that.
Should we leave this one open? Because it sounds like it's an ongoing conversation, but I'm also happy with the response in the matrix. So we could open additional ones now that people are ready to actually dig in. Oh, you'd keep it open? Okay.
That's fine. It's a good container for the discussion. Okay, I'm no longer sharing the right thing, so.
Can keep it open, but there's no additional staff response needed at this time, except for possibly a table with the changes. I guess we'll leave it open.
Okay, issue number 4 is about kind of the conversations that we've been having with particularly those who build housing in the community. And there have been a couple of workshops, and then there's actually another meeting today with housing developers, and I believe there's going to be another one tomorrow.
I feel like there is transparency between the city and developers based on what I'm seeing here, so I think we can close this issue.
Okay, issue 8 is open, but what we've said is that we'll address it in a couple of weeks. So we'll keep that open. Issue 9 is about parking garage convertibility from Commissioner Woodyer.
Pretty cool, and I think you can close it. That's pretty, these types of additions just really help me to visualize the meaning behind the words, so this is really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, Disability Employment Program from Commissioner Copley.
Yeah, this is great feedback. Appreciate it. Look forward to seeing more detail about this as you guys put it together. We can close this.
Okay, we're back in the land of neighborhood mixed use because it bleeds a little bit from the zoning map into the zoning chapter. Is the idea with neighborhood mixed use complete redevelopment? And the answer is it depends on each site, what's there. Okay, so this one's okay to close, is that what?
Yeah, this is okay to close.
Okay, and with neighborhood mixed use, could the city acquire property for neighborhood mixed use? And the answer is in Washington State, probably not.
Thank you. We can close this.
And you can close the next one as well,
Okay, which is about
which is
rezoning.
number 14.
And just on issue 13, this didn't make it into the matrix, but just for everybody's information, it's a constitutional limitation in the state constitution about how public funds can be used. Okay, 14 was the end. And then there were some new ones added that I've got in my notes that we'll add onto the matrix between now and next time.
Great. And it sounds like if people have additional thoughts on the new material especially, and especially now that we have a little bit more context on particularly the green building incentives and the table in 2167020, perhaps people can just go take another look at that for next time. Because that was very helpful context, but I didn't feel like it was really in the memo, so
Okay.
that was great.
Definitely. And there will be more new content for next time as well. And I think, given that feedback, I think it'll still be helpful to talk about it, but maybe like a few sentences in the memo about each chapter, just to refresh people's memory about what's the why. The slideshows were some time ago at this point.
Yeah, that sounds great. No, not right now, but if you would like to send an email to the Planning Commission, then we'll get it and can address it for our next meeting. Yeah, thank you for attending. All right, so with that, I think we'll move on to staff and commissioner updates.
Don't really have any updates, just a reminder that our next meeting is November 20th, which is the third Wednesday instead of our normal fourth. And then we'll continue the public hearing on the zone in there, so we kept that open. And then November 19th is an important date. That's when council will be hopefully adopting the comprehensive plan. I believe there's an event planned for that.
There'll be a little celebration during the meeting.
Yep.
All of you should receive an invitation that will come from the mayor's office sometime pretty soon.
Lovely.
Please come if you can.
That's all I have. Thanks.
Other commissioner updates? All right. Well, with that, I look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 All right. Then we are adjourned.